All right, everybody. I just want to take a few minutes and look over, just give you, I know we've talked about before, I've written on your papers before, but I think because we're not all together, I think it's important for us to kind of give you this information and kind of remind you of it, kind of leave this out here. Some things to be thinking about as you write your persuasive paper. First off, let's start with the obvious. It has to be persuasive. Periodically, I get papers that are very informative, have a lot of really good information, but in the end, they're really not trying to persuade us to do anything. Make sure that you remember that the purpose of this paper is to persuade. You are going to take one solution only. That's it, just one solution, and you are advocating it as the thing that will make the most difference. Remember, it has to be something logical, possible, probable, something that people can do. People would see that and say, "Yep, that will make a difference," and that is something that I can do. And so you want to make sure that you are trying to get people to buy into that, right? Make sure that you are really explaining that problem and that solution, and you're trying to sell us on it. With that in mind, also, one of the things that we talk about, one of the components of the paper is the benefit statement, right? That you have to show what's in it for me. What do I get out of it for doing this? That's part of the persuasive process, right? As part of the persuasive process, that you build a case, you show what the problem is, you say, here's the solution, here's how it will make a difference, and then here's why you should do this, why you should get involved, okay? This benefit statement is not the last paragraph, and I know a lot of times people try to, they go, in conclusion, you can see why to do this because, da, da, da. This is a piece of the paper, this is not the conclusion, so make sure that this is before we get to the conclusion, right? This is a separate piece. There is no definitive order that the paper has to go in. It doesn't have to be point, but the most logical process is to say, here is a problem, here's the cause, so here's an issue, and here's what makes it a problem. This is the bulk of the paper. It's probably going to be all but the last, all but 3 or 4 of the body paragraphs. Here's the solution. That's going to be 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then here's the benefit. And that benefit statement is probably just going to be a paragraph. Again, those are round numbers and suggestions. They're not set in stone, so don't think that you have to do it that way. But that is kind of one of the ways that a lot of people approach this, and it is one of the more logical ways of doing it. And again, the amount, when I talk about paragraphs, those aren't set in stone either. They're just kind of suggestions or guidelines to go by. Make sure that the sources you use are really good and solid, that they really back things up, they really explain things, they really show that you really give the credentials of that source, and they really show what the problem is, they really explain that problem, they show why it's a good solution, how that will make a difference. Really make sure that the sources you use are benefiting your paper. In fact, that's the question you should always ask yourself. And I know we've talked about that before, but how does this help my paper, right? And you want to make sure that anytime you use a source, it answers that question. How does this benefit my paper? It says it the way I can't say it. It provides a really solid piece of information. It backs up my solution or my claim, okay? So make sure that the sources you use really get that across. For this paper, no I, no you, no first person, no second person. So no I, me, my, our, we, none of those, okay? And no you. We should probably get rid of the second person too. Now, first off, these are probably too casual for a formal paper like this. So that's the first reason why we do that. The next reason, though, is that if you don't use those correctly, if you didn't do them correctly, you make some implications that you may not necessarily want to make. For instance, if saying something this, what you're implying is that you aren't doing it already, right? Or that you're incapable of doing it. And so what you want to make sure is that by using those, by not using those things, you're not making implications that you don't really mean. I do believe that there are times when maybe you have to use the I. If you feel like you really have to use that first person because you want to show like your personal story and how you're connected, and maybe you think that'll really get people to buy into you more, limit that to either the introduction or the conclusion, okay? Very, very limited stance. Now, we have talked before about this, about how the I or the first person sometimes makes it difficult for the audience to understand your motivations or your biases or why you do this. What was it that you're really trying to do? Like, are you looking for sympathy, glory? Are you trying to show something? A lot of times when people say, "Can I use this story about that happened to me?" My answer to that is always, well, is this the typical? Is this the norm, or is yours something way off into a different field? If it is way off into a different field, it's very unique. The question is, why is it so unique, or is it too unique that people won't buy into it? And then if it's like the norm, the mainstream, then I'd say, well, if it's the norm, then there's got to be other people that have the same thing happen to them. So use their story, not yours. Anytime you can build some distance between you and your paper, you and your audience, I think that's beneficial. Now, we all know that you believe in this. We all know that you have some stake in it because you are advocating or you're writing about it. This is true. But because we just don't want the audience to get confused as to your motivations, let's just keep ourselves out and leave the implied part there. Watch your commas. And I know I've written this on several different people's papers before. This is probably the one thing about grammar that is the most difficult to do. I have problems with it. I make mistakes with it. I know a lot of people have problems with understanding, does a comma go here? Does it go here? Does it go here? Where am I going to do it? So a couple comma rules in general. Anytime you use a conjunction, you probably are going to have a comma with it, right? If you read the sentence out loud and you feel like there's a pause there, right? Like it makes sense to take a little bit of a pause at this one place, that's probably a comma. Now, if it's at the end of a sentence and it's a long pause, that's a period. So don't be totally confused and don't emphasize it too much. But a way to kind of get a handle on this is just kind of read it to yourself, listen for those short pauses. And if it sounds natural to take that pause, that might be a place for a comma. Some people are using subordinating conjunctions to start a sentence. However, unfortunately, because now I know in the real world there are times when that works and that we can do that. And I think that you might be able to pull it off in this paper too. I'm not saying you're incapable of doing this, but you really have to understand why you're doing that. Because a lot of people will have a sentence, a period, however, comma, and then something. In that sense, that subordinated conjunction really is combining that first sentence with that second sentence. So use a semicolon, however, because, unfortunately, therefore, comma, and then that second sentence. Do not start a sentence with a subordinated conjunction because it will make that a fragment. It makes it a dependent clause, and it makes it a fragment. The final thing to think about that, again, I've written on several people's papers is the idea of how to break up your paper into paragraphs. The general rule of thumb is new idea, new paragraph. Okay. So if I'm talking about my favorite car and what it was and what we did with it, and then I'm going to go into a story about how it was wrecked, that's probably a paragraph break because I'm going from one idea to another. And so you really want to break your ideas apart like that. New idea, new paragraph. That allows your reader to have this like mental pause in between ideas so they can digest things. Okay. But I think the other piece too there that really helps them out is it gives them one piece of information to deal with. And for you, it shows you like, okay, I'm done with an idea. I can stop and then I can look back and say, did I really, explain that well? Did I give all the information that needs to be there? And go on. Now, I know in high school, we told you that you had to have like 5 sentences per paragraph. That isn't really true. I know in the real world, it can be any number of sentences. You can have a 2-sentence paragraph, and that's totally okay, as long as you're using it correctly. Like maybe that's like a transition thought from this point to this point over here. So, keep in mind that it can be any length, but that each paragraph shows one idea and that you really need to make sure that the idea is fully developed. As you kind of write the paper, feel free to share that with me, to use that tutor.com. Other resources, have other people read it, share it with other people in the class. Anything you can do to get other eyeballs on the paper will be beneficial. Okay. And remember, if you have any specific questions, to direct those to me so that I can help you and give you that information directly. Good luck on your paper.